That night, at one of Chicago's most expensive restaurants, a woman walked in wearing a garish wig, heavy clown-like makeup, and an attitude sharp enough to clear the room. She chewed loudly, spoke in clipped, dismissive sentences, and behaved as though she was actively trying to ruin the evening. Because she was. Victoria Hale, CEO of a $500 million tech company, had disguised herself as someone impossible to love just to make one man walk away. But Adrian Cole didn't walk away. He sat across from her, calm and unbothered, and started paying attention to exactly the wrong things. Victoria Hale had a rule she never broke: no blind dates. She had held that rule for 3 years, and in those 3 years, she had built her company from a 40-person startup into one of Chicago's most watched tech firms. She had no patience for small talk, less patience from men who looked at her resume before they looked at her face, and absolutely zero interest in sitting across a dinner table from someone her mother had vetted through a mutual connection. The rule was simple. The rule was clean. Then her mother called on a Thursday afternoon and used the one argument Victoria had no defense against: family obligation, and the rule was gone. She didn't know much about the man. His name was Adrian Cole, a friend of a friend, someone described as stable and serious, which in her family's language meant he had money and wasn't embarrassing at events. Victoria didn't bother researching him. She had been to enough of these dinners to know they all ended the same way. The man spent the first 20 minutes pretending to be interested in her opinions, then spent the rest of the evening steering the conversation toward her company's valuation. She knew the pattern. She was tired of the pattern. So the night before the dinner, standing in her bathroom with a glass of wine she hadn't touched, Victoria made a decision. She wasn't going to cancel. Canceling would start a conversation she didn't want to have. Instead, she was going to make him leave. She was going to walk in as someone so completely off-putting that the man would find a polite excuse within 30 minutes and disappear, and she would go home, order takeout, and never hear about it again. It was efficient. It was controlled. It was, she told herself, the rational solution. The wig came from a costume shop 3 blocks from her apartment. It was bright copper red, badly layered, and sat slightly off-center no matter how she adjusted it. The makeup took her 45 minutes to get wrong, on purpose: too much foundation eyeliner drawn heavier than it needed to be, lipstick, a shade of dark plum that clashed with everything. She wore a dress that was technically fine, but styled in a way that read as trying too hard. When she looked in the mirror, she didn't recognize herself, which was exactly the point. She took a cab to the restaurant instead of her usual car service, because showing up in a company vehicle would have undone the entire effect before she walked through the door. Maison Verlaine was the kind of restaurant where the lighting was designed to make everyone look like they belonged there. White tablecloths, low music servers, who moved like they had been trained never to rush. Victoria had eaten there before at real dinners in her real clothes. Walking in that night felt like wearing a costume inside a painting she had once posed for. The hostess gave her a look that lasted half a second too long before leading her to the table. Adrian Cole was already seated. He stood when she approached, which she noted without reacting to. He was taller than she expected, dressed simply a dark jacket. No tie, the kind of understated that either meant he didn't care, or that he cared in a way that had nothing to prove. He had a calm face, not handsome in the way that announced itself, but the kind of face that would stay in your memory longer than a prettier one. Victoria sat down across from him, dropped her bag loudly on the chair beside her, and picked up the menu without saying hello. Adrian sat back down and looked at her without saying anything either. He didn't fill the silence with a compliment or a nervous comment about the restaurant. He just waited the way someone waits when they are genuinely comfortable and not performing comfort. Victoria found that mildly irritating, so she leaned into the performance harder. She ordered for herself, without asking if he was ready, spoke to the server in a tone that was several degrees too sharp, and made a comment about the breadbasket that was designed to land badly. Adrian watched all of this. He didn't flinch, didn't straighten in his seat the way men did when they were deciding whether to stay or start formulating their exit. He just picked up his own menu and read it like she hadn't said anything at all. "You're quieter than I expected," Victoria said, making it sound like an insult. Adrian looked up from the menu. "You're louder than I expected," he said, and his tone carried nothing hostile in it, just an observation stated the same way he might have noted the weather. Victoria blinked. That was not the response she had scripted in her head. She had prepared for discomfort, for polite tension, for the gradual building of a social awkwardness that would make leaving feel like relief. She had not prepared for someone who seemed genuinely unbothered. She chewed her bread loudly, talked over the ambient music when she spoke, and at one point made a dismissive remark about freelance work that was pointed enough that most men would have taken it personally. Adrian didn't take it personally. He answered her directly, said that he liked the independence of his work, and then asked her a question about hers, not about her company's revenue or its market position, but about what problem she had originally set out to solve when she started it. Victoria opened her mouth to deflect the way she always deflected that question in interviews, and then stopped. No one had ever asked her that in a first conversation. They asked how big her team was, how she had funded the first round, whether she was planning to go public. They asked about the company as a financial object. Adrian had asked about the reason she built it, which was a different question entirely, and one she hadn't thought about in a long time. She gave him a short, guarded answer. He listened without interrupting, without the nodding that people did when they were waiting for their turn to speak. When she finished, he said, "That's actually a hard problem to solve," in a way that meant he had heard what she said and thought about it for a moment before responding. Victoria put her fork down. Something was not going the way it was supposed to go. The dinner stretched past the 30-minute window she had mentally budgeted. Adrian didn't perform interest. He either was interested or he wasn't, and right now he appeared to be. He talked when he had something to say, and didn't fill the spaces with noise. He didn't ask about her family, didn't try to establish how his world connected to hers, didn't position himself. He was just there, across the table present, in a way that Victoria was not accustomed to in these situations. By the time the main course arrived, she was still in the costume, still technically running the same plan, but she had stopped enjoying it. Somewhere between his first response and his second, the performance had started to feel less like a strategy and more like a wall she had built between herself and something she couldn't quite name yet. Adrian Cole had not walked away, and for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, Victoria Hale wasn't sure she wanted him to. The dinner ended without the outcome Victoria had planned. Adrian didn't excuse himself early. He didn't manufacture a phone call or check his watch with the practiced subtlety of someone counting down to an exit. He stayed through dessert, which he didn't order, but sat through while she picked at hers. And when the check came, he reached for it in a way that wasn't a performance. No glance to see if she would protest. No theatrical gesture. He just paid it. They walked out of Maison Verlaine at 9:15, and he held the door open for her, the same way he had held it when she arrived, which was to say, simply without commentary. Outside on the sidewalk, the October air was cold enough to make the separation feel natural. Victoria had her cab already mentally summoned. She was ready to end the night on her terms, to walk away with the evening classified as a failed experiment she could quietly forget. Adrian looked at her with the same unreadable steadiness he'd had all night, and said, "I'd like to do this again sometime, if you want to." Not framed as a question exactly, but leaving room for the answer to be no. Victoria said she'd think about it, which was the most honest thing she had said all evening, and got in the cab. She spent the ride home trying to locate the feeling that the evening had gone wrong. It had gone wrong. She was certain of that. The plan had not worked. Adrian had not left. By that measure, the night was a failure, and yet when she got home and stood again in her bathroom removing the wig and washing off the heavy makeup layer by layer, she could not find anything that felt like relief. She felt something closer to the particular unease of a question you didn't know you were asking until someone almost answered it. She agreed to see him again. She told herself it was curiosity, which was close enough to true that she didn't examine it further. She showed up the second time without the wig, without the theatrical makeup and clothes that were simply hers. And when Adrian opened the door of the coffee shop he'd suggested, there was no flicker of surprise on his face. He looked at her, the way someone looks at a room they've entered before. Recognized. Comfortable. Victoria found that more unsettling than any reaction would have been. She still wasn't herself with him. She kept the walls up, kept her answers shorter than they needed to be, let long stretches of quiet sit between them without trying to fill them. Part of her was still running the original logic, the more difficult she made. This the faster it would end. But Adrian had a way of treating difficulty as neutral information rather than a problem. When she was sharp, he didn't soften or retreat. He just responded to exactly what she'd said without adding anything to it. When she was evasive, he didn't push. He seemed to have a precise sense of where the line was between interest and pressure, and he never crossed it. What confused her most was what he didn't do. He didn't ask about her company after that first dinner. He didn't reference it, didn't angle toward it, didn't make comments that were designed to let her know he was aware of what she was worth. In her experience, that awareness always surfaced, sometimes subtly, sometimes with embarrassing directness, but always eventually. With Adrian, it simply didn't. He talked about a building he was designing on the north side, described the problem of a client who kept changing the load-bearing specifications after the plans were finalized, and the way he talked about it made clear he found the work genuinely interesting, not as a topic of conversation, but as a real thing happening in his real life. Victoria caught herself listening without performing the act of listening. "Why architecture?" she asked, during a gap in conversation she hadn't tried to manage. Adrian considered the question for a moment, not as though he was deciding what to say, but as though he was locating the actual answer. "Because a building has to be honest," he said. "You can't fake the structure. Everything decorative is secondary to whether the thing holds up." He said it plainly, as a fact, not a philosophy. Victoria didn't respond. She looked at her coffee cup and thought about what it would feel like to be assessed by that particular standard. It was a Thursday morning, 8 days after the first dinner, when Adrian found out who she was. He was at his drafting table with a business journal his colleague had left behind, flipping through it without intent. And then the page turned, and the photograph was there. Victoria Hale in her real clothes, at a real event under a headline about her company's latest funding round. The name matched. The face matched under the removed costume of that first evening. He sat with it for a while before he called her. He didn't open with anger. He said her name, her real name, which he had known only as Victoria, and now understood fully, and asked if she had time to meet. His voice on the phone was the same as it always was, controlled, but not cold. She knew immediately that he knew, because the quality of the silence after his question was different from all the silences that had come before it. They met that afternoon at a park bench near the river, and Adrian waited until they were both seated before he spoke. "The woman in the photograph is wearing your face," he said, "minus about 40 minutes of effort in the wrong direction." He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't hardened either. He was simply looking at her with the directness that was apparently just his face's default setting. Victoria looked at the river. She had rehearsed a version of this conversation in the cab over something measured, something that framed it as a practical decision, something that would position her as reasonable. But sitting next to him with the thing already in the open, the rehearsed version felt like another costume, and she was tired of costumes. "I do it at every blind date my family sets up," she said. "I make it bad enough that the person leaves. It's cleaner than canceling." She finally looked at him. "You were supposed to leave." Adrian didn't respond right away. When he did, it wasn't with the wounded reaction she had half expected. "Why does it have to be that hard to just say no?" he asked. "Because saying no starts a conversation," she said. "And the conversation is always the same. I'm too focused on work. I'm too particular. I'm too—" She stopped herself. "People assume they know why a woman like me is still single, and they're always very willing to explain it to me." Adrian nodded once, as if that part made sense to him. "Did you think I was one of those people?" he asked. Victoria didn't answer immediately. Then she said, "I thought you would behave the way people behave when they find out what I run and how much it's worth. Everyone does. Eventually." She met his eyes. "You didn't. That's the only reason I agreed to see you again." There was a long beat before Adrian spoke. "For the record," he said, "I thought there was something off about you that first night. The wig was—" He exhaled in a way that wasn't quite a laugh. "I didn't say anything because it wasn't my business, but you were clearly uncomfortable the whole time, and not in the way someone is uncomfortable on a bad date. More like someone wearing shoes that don't fit." Victoria looked at him for a moment without speaking. In years of running a company, in years of rooms full of people paid to observe and analyze, no one had said anything that precise about her. It left no room to deflect. She told him the truth then. Not all of it, but enough that she had been cycling through her family's introductions for 2 years. That every man she met through those channels arrived with a prior understanding of her net worth that colored everything that followed, that she had stopped trusting first impressions because first impressions were always about the company and not about her. Adrian listened to all of it without the expression people wore when they were waiting to offer comfort. He just let her say it. When she finished, he said, "That sounds exhausting," simply without decoration. And somehow, that was more accurate than anything more elaborate would have been. They kept seeing each other after that. Quietly, without announcements. Adrian didn't post anything, didn't mention it to people outside his immediate circle, and Victoria told no one inside hers. For a few weeks, it was just dinners and long walks and phone calls that went longer than either of them planned. It felt like something fragile that would survive only in the absence of outside weather. But outside weather has a way of arriving anyway. It started with a single item in a business column, a gossip note, barely a paragraph, about Victoria Hale being seen repeatedly with an unknown man. The description was flattering to neither of them. Freelance architect with no significant industry profile. By the following week, the tone had shifted. A financial blog ran a piece implying that a man with Adrian's lack of corporate standing had no plausible reason to be in Victoria's orbit unless the reason was financial. It was phrased carefully, just close enough to insinuation, without being a direct claim. But insinuation in that particular world was sufficient. Victoria's head of communications sent her a message asking if she wanted to make a statement. Her board chair, a man named Gerald Foss, who had opinions about everything that touched the company's reputation, called her on a Friday morning and used the phrase "optics concern" 3 times in 4 minutes. Victoria listened to all of it with the flat attention she used when she was deciding whether something was a real problem or someone else's discomfort dressed up as a real problem. The distinction mattered to her, but the distinction was getting harder to hold. Adrian, for his part, said nothing about the coverage to her directly. He had seen it. It was impossible not to, but he didn't raise it, didn't ask her to make a statement or stay quiet or take any particular position. He just continued to show up the same way he always had, present, undemonstrative, steady, which under ordinary circumstances she would have found reassuring, but now felt like watching someone stand on ice without knowing how thick it was. She started measuring the distance between his world and hers in ways she hadn't before. He worked independently, structured his own hours, moved through the city without the weight of a public profile. Victoria moved through it differently. Every public appearance logged every photograph, potentially captioned every association, a variable that someone somewhere was already calculating. She started returning his texts a few hours later than usual. She stopped mentioning when she'd be free the following week. None of it was decided consciously. It was the slow rearrangement of behavior that happens when a person is afraid and doesn't want to admit what they're afraid of. The article that ended things ran on a Tuesday. It was not a gossip column this time. It was a piece with a byline in a publication that business people actually read, and it made the suggestion with enough structured argument to sound responsible. The headline was, "Who is Adrian Cole and what does he want from Victoria Hale?" The piece ran through his professional history, noted the modesty of his client list compared to the scale of her company, and ended with a quote from an unnamed source that described him as strategically positioned. Victoria read it at 6 in the morning, standing in her kitchen before she'd had coffee, and felt the specific cold clarity that comes with a problem that has arrived in a form you can't simply ignore. She called her communications director. She sat in 2 meetings that morning where the article was discussed as a company matter, not a personal one. By the time she got to the part of the day when Adrian would normally have texted, she had been thinking about risk management for 6 consecutive hours and had lost the boundary between the professional and the personal, which was a boundary she usually guarded carefully and had let slip without noticing. He called instead of texting. She answered. He asked if she'd seen the piece, and she said yes. And then Adrian said quietly that it didn't matter to him what people assumed, that she knew the truth, and so did he. And that was enough for him to stay steady on it. He said it simply without pressure, the way he said most things. And Victoria, inside 6 hours of board language and damage control framing, heard it as naive. She said, "Adrian, this affects the company. I can't pretend it doesn't." There was a quality to her voice that she didn't fully register in the moment, the clipped, managed tone of someone addressing a problem, not talking to a person. There was a stillness on the line. Then Adrian said, "Is that what I am?" "Something that affects the company." His voice had not changed in volume or temperature, which made it worse. Victoria said, "That's not what I meant," but she didn't say what she did mean. And in the absence of that, the words that were already on the line just sat there and did their damage. Adrian said he understood. He said it the way someone says they understand when they have decided not to ask again. And then the call ended. He did not reach out after that. Victoria set her phone face down on her desk and went into her next meeting, and she did not let herself think about it until late that night, when the building was quiet and the day's logic had finally run out of room. Adrian Cole had looked at her, the real her, the one underneath the wig and the performance and the years of professional armor, and he had stayed. He had stayed through the disguise, stayed through the revelation, stayed through the weeks of her pulling quietly back. And then she had said exactly the wrong thing in exactly the wrong tone, and she had made him feel like a liability, like something to be managed. He had left because she had shown him in the clearest possible language that even she saw him the way everyone else said she would. Victoria sat at her desk in the dark and understood fully and without comfort what she had just let go of. She gave it 3 days. She told herself it was because she needed to think clearly, and thinking clearly required distance from the immediate feeling, and the immediate feeling was too large to work inside. Those were reasonable explanations. She had built a career on reasonable explanations, but by the 3rd night, sitting in her apartment with the city laid out beyond the window and nothing requiring her attention until morning, she ran out of reasonable explanations, and what was left underneath them was simpler and harder to argue with. She had hurt someone who had never once tried to hurt her, and she had done it efficiently and deliberately, the way she did most things. Victoria was good at a specific kind of honesty, the kind that lived in boardrooms and negotiations, in the clear-eyed assessment of risk and return. She could tell a room full of investors that a product wasn't ready and watch the temperature drop and hold her position anyway. She had never had difficulty saying hard things in professional contexts. The difficulty, it turned out, was saying true things in personal ones, not because she didn't know the truth, but because in her personal life, the truth always arrived with exposure attached, and exposure had never felt safe, in the way that competence felt safe. She thought about what Adrian had said at the park bench. That sounds exhausting, and how accurate it had been, not just about the blind dates, but about the whole structure she had built around herself. The disguise on the first night had been its most literal form, but it wasn't the only form. She had been disguising things for years, the fact that she was lonely, in a way that success didn't fix the fact that she had stopped believing anyone would look past the company to find her specifically worth, knowing the fact that somewhere in the last several years, she had quietly given up on that possibility, without naming it a surrender. Adrian had not looked past the company. He had looked at her before he knew about the company, and then known about the company, and looked at her the same way. That was the thing she kept returning to, not as a romantic abstraction, but as a concrete and specific fact. The man had seen her in a garish wig behaving badly, had found out she was one of the most recognizable business figures in the city, and had not adjusted his posture toward her in either direction. He had just continued to see exactly what was in front of him. Victoria had spent years building things that worked. She recognized sitting in the dark that she had just destroyed the one thing that had ever worked, without her having to engineer it. She called her communications director on a Thursday morning and said she wanted to make a statement. Not a company statement, a personal one. Her communications director, a sharp woman named Dana Rourke, who had managed public-facing crises for a decade, went very quiet for a moment, and then asked what the statement would cover. Victoria told her. Dana said, "You understand, this will reframe the entire narrative about you, not just the article." Victoria said she understood. Dana said, "And you want to do it anyway?" Victoria said, "Yes." Dana was quiet for another beat, and then said, "Okay, let me help you do it right." The statement went out on a Friday afternoon, timed for the end of the news cycle, the way Dana always timed sensitive releases. It was not long. Victoria had written the first draft herself, and Dana had refined it without removing its essential quality, which was that it was direct and personal, and did not sound like it had been written by a committee. The statement said that the woman in the restaurant on the evening in question had been Victoria herself, wearing a deliberate disguise. It said that Adrian Cole had known nothing about her professional identity, when they met had behaved with complete integrity throughout, and had never at any point attempted to use their acquaintance for professional gain. It said that the insinuations published about him were false, that the source of the situation was her own choices, and that she was making this statement because a person who had done nothing wrong deserved to have the record corrected. She did not frame it as a PR move. She did not attach it to any company announcement or use it to redirect attention toward a product or initiative. It was simply the truth stated plainly under her name. Gerald Foss called her within 40 minutes of publication and said, with the careful tone of a man choosing his words, that he had concerns about the optics of the statement itself. Victoria told him she appreciated the input. She did not change anything. She drove to Adrian's building on a Saturday morning without texting first, because texting would have given him the option to decline before she'd had the chance to say what she came to say. She was aware this was not a consideration he had ever extended to her. He had always given her room to say no, and she noted the difference without feeling good about it. The building was a converted warehouse on the west side, the kind of neighborhood that was halfway through becoming something else. She rang the buzzer for his unit and waited. His voice came through the intercom after a moment. "Victoria." Flat but not closed. She said, "I know I should have called. I just needed to say something, and I was afraid if I called, you'd tell me it was fine, and I'd never actually get to say it." There was a beat. Then the door buzzed open. His apartment was the way she would have expected it to be if she had ever thought to expect anything open and ordered, with drawings and plans on one wall and bookshelves that were clearly used rather than arranged. He was in a plain shirt, and his feet were bare, and he looked like a person interrupted in the middle of an ordinary Saturday. He didn't fill the space between them with small talk. He just stood there and let her speak. Victoria had thought about how to start this for 3 days. She had drafted versions in her head, organized arguments considered framings. Standing in his apartment, all of it fell away, and she said the only thing that was left. "I treated you like a variable," she said. "Like something I had to account for. And you were the first person in years who looked at me like I was just a person, and I responded to that by talking to you like you were a line item in a risk assessment. I'm sorry. That's what I came to say." Adrian looked at her steadily. He didn't rush to respond, but it didn't feel like withholding it. Felt like he was actually taking in what she'd said before he decided what to do with it. The quality of his attention had always been like that, she realized. He didn't perform listening. He just listened. "I read the statement," he said, finally. "I know," she said. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," she said. "You didn't do anything wrong. The least I could do was say that, where people could see it." She looked at him directly. "I also wanted you to know that I meant what I said on the phone. It came out wrong. I know that's not enough to—" "What did you mean?" he asked, not sharply, but with the same precise interest he applied to everything. He wanted the actual answer. Victoria took a breath. "I meant that I was scared," she said. "I've spent so long protecting the company, protecting the image, managing what people see. And when the pressure came, I defaulted to that. I spoke to you in board language, because that's the language I use when I'm protecting something. I didn't realize until afterward that I was supposed to be protecting you instead." She met his eyes. "I've never actually had someone to protect before. I didn't know what it was supposed to feel like." Adrian was quiet for a long moment. He moved to the small kitchen area and poured 2 cups of coffee without asking if she wanted one, because she did. And apparently he already knew that. He set one on the counter near her, and then leaned against the opposite counter with his own, and the distance between them was not hostile. It was just honest. 2 people in a room with the truth already said, and the next step not yet decided. "You wore a wig to make me leave," he said, not unkindly. "You were still trying to make me leave on the second date. You took 3 days after that phone call before you came here." He said it without accusation. "I'm not saying any of that as a complaint. I'm saying it because you should know that I noticed, and I stayed paying attention anyway. That's not something I do automatically." He looked at his coffee cup for a moment. "It meant something to me. What happened on that call also meant something to me. I need you to know both of those things are true at the same time." Victoria nodded. "I know," she said quietly. "That's why I came." He looked up at her then, and something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, just the way a room shifts when someone opens a window. "What do you want, Victoria?" he asked. "Not what you think is practical, not what works for the company. What do you actually want?" She had been asked versions of this question before in strategy sessions and investor meetings and profile interviews, and she had always answered it in the language of goals and metrics and vision. She stood in Adrian Cole's apartment on a Saturday morning with cold October light coming through the tall windows, and she said, "I want someone who sees me when I'm not performing anything, and I want to stop being afraid of what that looks like." She let the words sit. "I haven't wanted something like that in a long time. I don't entirely know how to do it." Adrian set his coffee cup down. He crossed the space between them and stopped close enough that the conversation was no longer across a room. "It's not that complicated," he said, and his voice had the same unhurried quality it always had. But closer now, it had a warmth she had not let herself notice before. You just have to show up without the wig." Victoria made a sound that was close to a laugh, real and unguarded, in a way she hadn't been in his presence since the night at the park bench. He wasn't smiling exactly, but there was something in his face that hadn't been there at the beginning of the conversation, something open and decided. He handed her coffee back to her, and she took it. They didn't resolve everything that morning. There was no speech that sealed it, no single moment that rewound the damage and replaced it with something clean. What there was, two people sitting at a kitchen table for the better part of 2 hours, talking the way they had talked in the earliest part of knowing each other, without agenda, without performance, without either of them running a separate calculation behind their eyes. Victoria told him things she had not told anyone in her professional life. He told her things that were quieter and smaller, but offered in the same spirit of just being honest about what his life actually was. They talked until the coffee was gone, and the light in the apartment had shifted from morning to midday. When she left, he walked her to the door, and before she stepped out, she turned and looked at him, the way she had been unable to look at him that first night, directly without the protection of a character she was playing. "I'd like to do this again," she said. "The right version of it." Adrian looked at her with the same expression he'd had in that first restaurant, that unhurried, accurate attention that had unsettled her because she had never encountered it before, and now understood was simply what it looked like when someone was genuinely present. "Yeah," he said. "I know." She took the stairs down instead of the elevator. Outside, the street was ordinary and cold and entirely itself, and Victoria Hale walked through it as exactly who she was. No disguise, no performance, nothing managed or calculated or arranged for someone else's consumption. Just a woman on a sidewalk in October who had, for the first time in longer than she could clearly account for, told the complete truth about what she wanted and been met with. Something that might, if she let it turn into the real thing. She didn't know yet if she would be good at this, but she showed up without the wig. That was where it started.